and welcome to another Perusia podcast. I'm Charbel Raish, your host, and I'm very excited about our guest today. It's his first time with us. Not sure if you know him. He's appeared on many different Catholic podcasts. He's the founder of Souls and Hearts Ministry, soulsandhearts.com, and he's a clinical psychologist. And he's a clinical psychologist for over 20 years and has a very strong faith. So I'd love to unpack a bit about that with him. His name is Dr. Peter Malinoski, and he joins me from the States live. Hello, Dr. Peter. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It is an honor to be with you, Charbel. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. We are on the other sides of the world, but it's so wonderful through technology we can connect like this and really share, I guess, truth and our stories together.
Yeah.
So maybe because it is your first time, Doctor, I'd love to just touch a bit about your background. You are a practicing Catholic. Have you always been? Are you a cradle Catholic?
I am a cradle Catholic. Yes, I grew up. I was baptized, on a military base when I was just an infant. Went through 12 years of Catholic education. Grew up. Almost all of my childhood was in Wisconsin, up in the north.
Yep.
And so 12 years of Catholic education, and then off to college. So, yep.
And
then go ahead.
Did you ever fall away from your faith, or you stayed committed?
I never fell away, but in college. So where I grew up in Wisconsin, it was almost all Catholics and Lutherans. Very little sort of religious diversity, kind of a bubble in some ways. So it was very easy to be Catholic in a sense. Mm-hmm. And when I went off to university, I really wasn't prepared for what I was going to find there. And I found myself in a situation in where I experienced some real spiritual abuse and some real psychological abuse. Some trauma. And back in those days, back in the 80s, we're talking back in the mid 80s now, we didn't understand trauma very well at all. And so one of the things that I came away from as a young man, 22 years old, having gone through some pretty significant damage was, first of all, I never want this to happen to me again. Well, first of all, what happened? I never want it to happen to me again. And how can I keep it from happening to other people? How can I help other people recover? So then I actually never took a psychology class as an undergraduate, but then I went and got my PhD in clinical psychology with a real passion for grounding the understanding and the practice of psychology in a Catholic understanding of the human person. And I almost gave up because back in those days, there weren't any doctoral programs in psychology that were Catholic in the United States, not one. There were some at Catholic universities, but they were far from being Catholic. And it was through the grace of God. It was through St. Teresa of Avila, through Dietrich von Hildebrand, his book, and Transformation in Christ, Phenomenology. And it was through some good supervision in doing some clinical work that I was able to say, okay, I think there's a way that we could actually ground the practice of psychology in a Catholic understanding of the human person and bring together what we're learning, because then in those days, the field of traumatology really took off in 1991. There were all kinds of new things coming in, but they were disconnected with the perennial wisdom of the Catholic Church. So that's really what my passion is. It's about overcoming the natural level obstacles, the obstacles in our humanity, in our human development that keep us from a deep, intimate, and personal relationship with God our Father, especially, and with Mary our Mother. Because so much of the trouble that we have as a depth psychologist, I'll say, goes back to the ways that we were formed. Because our earthly parents were imperfect. So that's really what this is all about. And that's been my passion to say, okay, first for the 20 years that I've spent in private practice, and now kind of trying to bring that out to a much broader audience. So.
Yeah, I'm excited to unpack all that. I can't move on without at least touching on, you said you experienced personal trauma.
Yes.
How long did it take? I guess, have you overcome that? Was it a process? And I don't know how much you're happy to share, but
no, it involved some real psychological coercion that was laced with a bunch of quasi-Catholic spiritual direction and things like that. So there was, there was this experience that I had of being manipulated, and not realizing it at the time, not understanding that a lot of what was happening was actually not Catholic at all. And so I really got into like, okay, what happened in me? And I did some work in my own life. I went to therapy. It struggled with this in the spiritual realm. Got some help from a variety of different sources. And yeah, I would say that I overcame it. But again, I also think that there are always things that are unresolved, right? There's always things that are unresolved. So still in a process of becoming, but I'm grateful for it. And this is really what I want for people that have experienced trauma, is that they get to the point where they see the providential hand of God in everything that happened. That Romans 8:28 still holds, right? All things work together for good for those who love the Lord. And that includes whatever kind of trauma. God knew before the beginning of time everything that would happen to me, everything that would happen to you, everything that would happen to every single person on the planet, and has a plan for that. And how do we understand that? But also don't just spiritualize everything, get the help that we need in the natural realm, work with our human formation as well. So the best of both.
Brilliant. Oh, okay. Thank you for saying that. Just about your professional world then. So I guess we're in the 90s now. Did you have your own clinic? You're a clinical psychologist. What was it like in your professional world? A bit about your career, I guess.
Yeah. So I went to graduate school in 1993 to Ohio University. Like I said, there weren't any Catholic programs. I went to a really secular program. Really went looking for some mentorship, for some guidance, hoping that someone would take me under their wing. A lot of disappointments about that. What I didn't realize at the time is I was really looking for God, a deeper relationship with God, but I was trying to see if one of these faculty members, one of my advisors or so forth, would help me out. And was really unimpressed with what I was learning. I was in a program that heavily emphasized research, so it wasn't as emphasizing as much the clinical side. And I didn't get great supervision when I was in my graduate program. So I went into my clinical internship thinking maybe I'm going to go into academia, and I retreated into pain control, behavioral medicine, things like that, because it felt like at least I knew I could do something good, because I knew that with what I had in graduate school, I wasn't getting to the core. I wasn't helping people tolerate being loved and then loving in return. We weren't getting to that level. And what I figured out was that it is a terrible thing to tolerate the love of God, because what people don't understand is that the love of God is given freely, but it's not received freely. You can't just take in the love of God and expect that nothing's going to change. What people often want, at least on the surface, is what more like Hallmark movie love, which doesn't require any effort. It comes naturally. Everybody's happy and so forth. But if you're going to actually take the love of God in, it's going to burn away things that are not only sinful, but things that are disordered, things that are imperfect. It's also going to ask you to give up lesser goods for those greater goods. And so I was really impressed when I was on your website. I saw that, that in your mission, in your vision, you are looking at this deep personal relationship with God. That's exactly what I'm looking for too, is for people to be able not to look at Catholicism as a moral code, not to focus on the spiritual life as primarily the building of virtue, but actually what we're called to is a deep and intimate personal relationship with the three persons of the Trinity and with Our Lady. And as a clinical psychologist, I'm particularly interested in a deep relationship with God the Father and Mary, our mother, because they're our primary parents. Our earthly parents are our secondary parents. God the Father, Mary, our mother, those are our primary parents. And any deficits that we had in our upbringing, and sure, there's going to be lots of them because all of our parents were sinners, those God had a plan to make up for those in his paternity and in Our Lady's maternity. So
wow. Oh, this is this is amazing. I'm excited about this because there's a lot of misinterpretation about what clinical psychology does, and many people, I guess, can focus too much on one or the other, and without seeing the complementarity of the two, and so the natural realm and the spiritual realm. And when does it? So with I'm just curious about being a clinical psychologist. In the secular world, there are many out there. Is there with your faith, what added layer does that give when you're, I guess, consulting people and giving, if you didn't have a faith and you're a clinical psychologist, I guess you can help to a degree so far, but when does that sort of require now the spiritual realm to come into play? I'm curious to see where the crossover is and what does that do?
So the practice, every psychology, the practice of every psychology, every school of psychotherapy, for example, is grounded on four other disciplines: philosophy, theology, metaphysics, and epistemology. Okay, every practice of psychology has these implicit assumptions, things that you just take for granted. So let me give you an easy example. Feminist psychologists, all right, they are going to basically take a worldview of feminism, whatever stripe of feminism they have, and they're going to practice in accordance with the assumptions of that worldview. So that's why there's not a lot of sort of conceptual unity in the field of psychology, is because the different philosophies and theologies, the epistemologies, the different metaphysical understandings of the human person, they're all so different. How they understand the human person is very, very different. Yeah. A lot of more secular approaches are essentially going to operate off of hedonism. They're going to operate off of a system that seeks to maximize pleasure and minimize pain.
Interesting.
And so in a system like that, suffering is seen as bad. Suffering is undesirable. There's not an understanding of the redemptive value of suffering, for example. That's just one small example. So what I'm really interested in is, okay, how do we start with divine revelation, what we know to be true, the perennial truths of the church, because then we get to cheat. We have a huge advantage then, because we're not just operating off of whatever anthropology the particular clinician happens to have. That's a really important thing. That's like a guiding star. And so that's really a fundamental thing. And one of the reasons why psychologists don't agree about a lot of things.
Interesting. I'm fascinated that the theology was one of those and metaphysics. So is that would be even across the secular
world? I mean, they don't talk about it a lot because how do you teach to a room full of people who have wildly different philosophical and theological ideas? So psychology has sort of said, okay, well, we're scientific, we're based off the scientific method and so forth, but there's a lot of art in the way that you do psychotherapy, if we're honest about that. And when you get to questions like identity, how you treat someone as a clinical psychologist is going to be very different if you see them as an agglomeration of atoms and molecules brought together by chance and evolution, or whether you see that person as a beloved son or daughter of God. Wow. It just changes everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? If you believe in Romans 8:28, which we mentioned before, all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, that's very different than if you've got a Hobbesian view of the world, that it's a dog-eat-dog place, that it's that it's all about like survival of the fittest and things like that. That's a very different worldview. And that's what gets so that's the thing that gets so lost sometimes, is that these underlying anthropological assumptions about the human person are going to inform the way that we practice, even if we don't think about it, even if we don't make it explicit. That stuff, all that stuff is operating implicitly. So what is the nature of God? What is the nature of, how are we called to be in relationship to each other? All of that informs the practice of psychology. And one of the troubles that we run into, Catholic psychologists, Catholic mental health professionals generally run into, is a lot of jadedness, a lot of suspicion, because people have come into contact with other mental health professionals that are operating off of these very different anthropologies and bring in things that, obviously can contradict with the Catholic faith. The important thing is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We want to be Catholic with a big C, but we also want to be Catholic with a little c. And we want to listen to St. Augustine when he tells us in De Doctrina Christiana, book 2, chapter 40, to despoil the Egyptians, to be able to take all of the good things that our Lord is offering us wherever they come from. So I would say to people that are really suspicious about psychology, do you believe in DNA? Do you believe in the double helix structure of DNA? Because if you do, that was discovered by Watson and Crick, both of whom demonstrated a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry. Right. So when you're thinking about saying the unconscious is nonsense because Freud was anti-religion, okay, so he was a poor theologian and an amateur philosopher, but he made some really important observations. Can we take the good from that? Can we understand what our Lord might have used him to discover? And can we sift out what's really helpful and from what's not, from what's true and good and beautiful from what's not?
That's a great point. How do we take the good from the natural world and from the secular world, from even faithless people, but take the good is always the good.
Absolutely.
There's so many directions we can go here, but I do want to know, just typically speaking, I guess from your experience, what are, I guess, the more common scenarios people would visit you for? I mean, I understand these days, and I don't know the exact stat, you could confirm this, but 1 in 3, I understand, of people are suffering from anxiety at some degree or another. Depression is at an all-time high. Is that correct? And in your experience, would they be, depression would come in many forms. Would this sort of type of
those are never the primary problems? Depression, anxiety, mania, psychosis, those are all symptoms. Okay. See, that's the problem in the field.
Please, unpack.
The problem in the field is that we don't understand what's an underlying problem and what's a symptom. Almost everything that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 5, we're on edition 5 now. Those are all symptom constellations.
Okay.
Mania, panic attacks, generalized anxiety, depression, all of those are just symptoms. It's sort of like if you went in to see your physician and he diagnosed you and he said, you have fever and abdominal pain disorder. He's not catching, he's just identifying symptoms. He's not catching that you have appendicitis, right? And if you don't get that appendicitis checked out, if he just gives you painkillers and Tylenol to reduce your fever, he's not done you any services. He's done you a disservice, actually. So a lot of the problem in modern psychology is that we are misdiagnosing, we're misunderstanding, we're looking at the symptom and saying that's the problem. And now let me be clear. If you have a symptom, let's say a fever of 108, that's a real problem in and of itself. That can kill you, right? So it's not that the symptoms are not important. I don't want to say that for severe depression or crippling anxiety or panic attacks, that those aren't problems. They are problems. They're problems in their own right. But when you trace them back, if you take a depth approach to psychology and you start to understand how are these things connected to identity, how are they connected to a sense of being loved? So they're basically, it all boils down to one thing and its opposite. It boils down to love and a lack of love. All disorder in the world, Charbel, came in because of original sin. It all came in because of sin. And what is sin? Well, you can understand sin in a lot of different ways. You can understand sin as a burden. You can understand sin as the breaking of a law. You can understand sin in a variety of different ways. I wrote a weekly reflection on this not long ago. But I like to look at sin as the breaking of relationship and the refusal to love. Ultimately, that's what sin is. It's anything that separates us from God, who is love. And so when you walk all of these back, what you're going to find is that every psychological disorder has its roots in not being loved or in not loving.
Interesting. So is this
So,
something profound through your faith that you discover this, or is this over
yeah,
time?
well, this is about thinking. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I mean, yeah, I mean, I didn't have something I could read back in 1991 when I started on this journey. But yeah, this is the fruit of a lot of prayer, a lot of talking with others that are struggling with these same kinds of things. And some of it is just going back to what we know to be true by our faith, right? Our faith does have important foundational questions. It answers important foundational questions for us. Like, where does evil come from? What is evil?
Yes.
You know, it's really helpful to know that evil is a privation of good. Evil exists where the good is not. And so when you couple that with, you know, with what we're finding from all these other disciplines, and not just psychology, but also things like neuroscience, and you start to make the connections, it's amazing what can happen then. But we have to be open. We have to be Catholic with a small c. We have to be open to information that comes from those outside the church.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's one of the disadvantages that sometimes Catholics experience, is because you are not going to find a good treatment for bulimia in the early church fathers. You're just not. You know, and to neglect how God may have wanted to show us, you know, ways to work with folks that struggle with that, you know, I think does them a disservice. So there's particular, you know, so we want to have both the openness, we want to have the benefit of the old and the benefit of the new.
Is it so back, I guess, back to then, what would be can you identify common traits or common, is it ultimately what you're saying is are people either there's a lack of love or lack of being loved and loving, but in all psychology and all sort of all of your clients or patients that come to see you, are there common traits that, without, you know, just
they struggle with this whole thing of love. Go back to Genesis 3. Everything starts in Genesis, right? Genesis 3, the first thing that happens right after the fall in the Garden of Eden is that Adam and Eve head off to the bushes and they hide from God.
Yeah.
You know, they've severed their relationship and they are not seeking to reestablish it. You know, what does God do? He comes and he calls out, "Where are you?" Now, God knows exactly where they are. Mm-hmm. He doesn't need to like have them answer in order to locate them in the bushes. He's doing that to let them know he's coming, because even though they've broken the one law he gave them, you know, he still loves them, right? There's a gentleness there. He takes care of them, gives them clothes, you know, and so forth. So what will lead to, there's basically one thing that separates people who get so much better from people who don't. And that is, can they be open to the idea of divine providence, that God loves them as a beloved son or daughter? You want to separate out the people that get better from the people that don't. In my practice, that's the deciding question. You know, because there are people that have undergone tremendous traumas, and who have been able to see the hand of God in them. You know, Saint Bakita, for example, you know, is a great example. Saint Maximilian Kolbe, another example, right? Believing in terrible circumstances that God was loving them, was with them. And then there are others who believe that God either ignored them, or that God condemned them, or that God didn't care, or that God hated them. You know, so this whole question of God images and self-images comes up. And these are the ways we feel in our bones. This is not our, you know, our frontal, you know, our frontal cortex and how we think about God from what, you know, Mrs. Stecker taught us in religion class in second grade. This is This is like what we feel in our bones. This is what was formed into us in these processes that happen long before we achieve the use of reason at 7 roughly, long before we could even talk. We are making assumptions about whether the world is safe or not, whether people are good or not, whether people in positions of authority love us or not, and we generalize those to God. I found this out like really early in my practice, because anytime I had a client that was talking about God as mother, I would hear about toxic father images, these toxic relationships with the father, abusive father, neglectful father, abandoning father, whatever. And what was going on is that this wasn't just a theological construct that the person was choosing. This was an attempt to preserve some kind of positive image of God, and the father image was just so toxic that it wouldn't work. So I could have taken, like some therapists do, unfortunately, a kind of catechetical approach and say, no, God revealed himself to us as father, or I could say, look, if we really work on these father wounds, if we can heal these father wounds, what I was finding is that then I didn't have to do much. And people were like, okay, now I can tolerate God as father, right? It wasn't a spiritual problem primarily, Charbel. It was a natural level problem that had to do with the trauma because of the harm, that the unresolved wounds of a bad relationship with dad.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And so I was finding that people had so many different kinds of, so when I started out, I was so green. I was greener than grass. And I was the only really Catholic psychologist for in 6,000 square miles. I had people coming from hours and hours away, 16,000 square kilometers. And so they would, I was one that was going to say, yeah, I'm Catholic. I wasn't a very good clinician, when I started out. And I learned in relationship with people, about, and I was seeing all these connections because I was trained psychoanalytically initially. Well, not initially. My initial training was all cognitive behavioral therapy and behavioral medicine and stuff like that. But after I got out of grad school, I worked under a psychoanalyst for 7 years, and what he taught me was a great experience. He taught me about depth. He taught me, about symbol. He taught me about looking way below the surface, about the difference between symptom and cause. And so yeah, I was starting to put these things. He wasn't Catholic, but I was bringing in the Catholic stuff, and so a lot of it was trial and error, and I appreciate the patients I had, or the clients I had early in my career, as I was fumbling around, trying to figure these things out.
Fascinating. Is it healings? Is it like a healing wound? These wounds people go through, traumas. Can they take longer and short? Some might take longer to get through these and overcome these than others, I imagine. It depends on how open the person's system is to love. Okay.
It really depends how open the person's system is to trusting, to tolerating the vulnerability around love. It doesn't have as much to do with symptom severity.
Okay.
It doesn't have as much to do with symptom severity. It has much more to do with, will the person dare? And for some people with complex trauma histories, I mean, I don't know if I would be able to come out of what they were coming out of. I wasn't given those. My story was different, but yeah, it's really about, can I believe? And they're going to have faith. Because faith is, this kind of trust or confidence in something you don't see. Often you're not going to be able to see it right away. We can acquire confidence in God in two ways. One, because of faith, and the second is because we tasted and saw. We're invited to, in the Psalms, to taste and see. And see the goodness of the Lord. That's a really visceral, relational thing. It's an embodied thing. Taste and see. Paul repeats it in Hebrews 6, if you believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. But it's a very visceral, relational, experiential aspect of this. It's not something you're going to study your way to. Some of the people I know I've had as clients that have had the most difficulty have had advanced degrees in philosophy and theology, have tried to think their way out of this. And that's not what we're called to do. We're called to become like little children. Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, but the kingdom of God is made up of such as these. So and there's a lot that we didn't understand 30 years ago. We didn't understand when I was in graduate school. When I started graduate school back in 1993, almost 30 years ago, we knew so much less about this stuff. And what's happened is that that now we are understanding the brain so much better. We're understanding neurochemical processes so much better. We're understanding it's been a real revolution. And so what I want to do is be able to bring these things. I don't expect that the bishops are going to understand this. I don't expect that priests are going to understand this very well. It's not really their area. But I think what we're called to do is kind of catch up with some of this and find the ways to be able to put these two things together.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. I mean, I can imagine how many different cases where priests have people who are struggling in many different fronts, and they're not, I guess, qualified to deal with many of these things. And however, they can give them support, they can give them guidance, and sometimes, I've heard this said, a good confession can heal a lot, but it's naming what it is, isn't it? We're talking quite a range of things people are going through, but I love how you just said earlier, it does distill down to really the way you love. Do you accept love, or are you loving? And it goes right back to Genesis and this understanding. Can I talk about then this need with the faith in the Catholic, in your experience now, in say in recent times, how are we faring now? Are there many other Catholic psychologists out there? Do you have colleagues that are working with you? Are there many people that you know of and can recommend? Because I imagine this would be a big help if there are Catholic psychologists out there.
When I originally hung my shingle up as a psychologist in 2001, there was one other Catholic mental health professional, like I said, in this huge area. Now we have 25. And so it's grown amazingly well. Yeah. We now have programs like Divine Mercy University that is grounded specifically in a Catholic anthropology. The Catholic Psychotherapy Association started up in the meantime, and they've got 600 or 700 members, worldwide, and an annual conference and a lively community. So we are in such a better place than where we were when I was starting out.
Yeah, praise God for that. And I imagine there's still plenty of work to do in this space, but this is great to know and learn. Could we do something here before I do want to dive into your ministry,
Okay.
But maybe as a dovetail, if there's people watching right now, and people struggling on all fronts right now,
yes,
and there are people on medication to deal with depression, anxiety. We've got many mental cases, and I'm just throwing this out. I'm not using any example. Right. I'm just throwing what's coming to my mind. ADHD and other types of conditions, and people are being told over and over again what they are. And you mentioned earlier these symptoms, but what does that do? There's a strong sense of loneliness. There's a strong sense of no one else cares. There's this idea out there, many struggle that I've come across personally, that no one gets it, no one gets me, no one understands what I'm going through.
Yep.
And there is where does a person like that right now, who's watching right now, and they feel that no one understands them, suicidal thoughts, you get people on where do they begin, and where do you recommend they I guess take their first steps in recovery? And on the other side of that coin are there people that don't know they have something, and sort of are there?
Let me start with that, Charbel. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So let's go back to Genesis. We'll go back to Genesis 3. And it's pretty clear to most Catholics what the impact of original sin was on the human body. catastrophic impact on the human body, because now you have aging, illness, sickness, you have death, right? You have pain, you have pain in childbirth, but just this catastrophic impact on the human body. And that's pretty evident from how we were before the fall. I argue that the impact on our psyches was even worse, and we can't see it. We don't see it because it's not so obvious. And so what trauma does, and my co-founder of Souls and Hearts, Jerry Crete, he calls original sin, he also refers to it as the original trauma. Yeah. Because what trauma does is it fragments the person inside. It actually creates division inside, because part of what defines trauma is an experience that's overwhelming to the person. It cannot be appreciated. It cannot be managed. So it's got to be broken up. It's got to be sort of siloed in different ways within the person, and it leads to internal division within the person. That's the hallmark of trauma, which is why dissociation is so commonly accompanies trauma. We can't put A and B and C together. We can't handle the intensity of that. And so what we're looking for, and this is straight out of St. Thomas Aquinas, what we're looking for is internal unity or internal integration. That's what we're looking for in a natural realm. And so when we're so fragmented, we have to tolerate being loved first. We have to tolerate being loved first.
Why do you say tolerate? I'm curious about that.
Okay, because it goes back to what we were talking a little bit about before. We know that with sin, there's a darkness that comes. There's a blindness that comes, right? There's a misunderstanding that comes. When Adam and Eve hid in the bushes, they hid from God. Their God image had deteriorated. They did not see God as he actually was. They did not understand love anymore because of the darkening of the intellect. And so when you experience love in a trauma state, that's not immediately experienced as necessarily good. Let's say that, for example, you come across a person just in ordinary life at work or at the bus stop, and you notice the person's kind of struggling maybe a little bit, and you're just kind of kind, and she draws away from you because she's sensing that if she becomes vulnerable, she's going to lose it. She's going to burst out crying. There's going to be a scene. And so what we need to be able to do, this is one of the reasons why I'm so adamant that we've got to get this human formation stuff right, is to be able to know how to love our neighbor. It doesn't look like we often think it does. And so to appreciate like how dangerous it seems to the person to be vulnerable again. You're never going to hurt me again. I'm it's like Paul Simon's song, I am a rock, I'm an island. A rock feels no pain and an island never cries. And he's got his books and his poetry to protect him. He's shielded in his armor. This is the protective reaction that happens to guard us against our shame, to guard us against our loss of identity as being beloved sons and daughters of God. And so there's a lot of gentleness that has to come in, a lot of patience. Often when people are traumatized, they act in ways that drive other people off because they're trying to protect themselves. They're fragmented inside. They're acting in ways that are at cross purposes of their deepest desires. And so it's a terrible thing to receive the love of God. Like I said, it's going to burn away anything that's sinful within us. It's going to burn away anything that we've relied on to try to help us survive. So there's like a lot of life and death decisions at least they're experienced as life and death decisions when people begin to trust God again, or when they begin to trust that somebody else might actually reflect the love of God to them.
That's interesting. Yeah, you're facing yourself, isn't it? And you've got to know yourself. And the first step to any recovery is to know and acknowledge your own faults.
And what do the saints say about themselves? How do the saints describe
They're
themselves?
sinners, the greatest sinners, and yeah,
and so when I was in high school, I thought, well, they're just kind of, they're overdoing it. That's that pious hyperbole. They're gilding the lily. This is just like, but as I begin to understand things a little more deeply, I'm like, no, they were in touch with their wretchedness. And the reason they could be in touch with their wretchedness and not lose their minds is because they understood that they were loved by God. That's what allows them to see. It's not that they're more wretched than the rest of us. They're not, but they can actually hold that there could be this disorder inside. There could be this confusion, this chaos, this wretchedness, however you want to describe that. But it's okay because God loves them anyway. And so there is this, and then once they can hold that, then they can hold that love could have a purifying effect within them, right? So yeah, people do not understand what a terrible thing it is, what a dangerous thing it seems to be for someone who's traumatized to allow that themselves to be loved.
Yeah, I could see it now. Yeah, I could see what you mean. At first, I was wondering, what on earth are you saying? Where are you going with that? But I understand. It can be confronting, and wow. Can we just touch on it? I think it's a big one, because we talk about the world out there that don't know God are talking about freedom, this lack of understanding of freedom, and this will sort of lead into your ministry, which is quite important to find this. But freedom is to do whatever you want, however you want, to whoever you want, as often as you want. And it's very much about pleasure seeking, and it misses the mark, I guess, on things, because it leads to, unfortunately, addiction. So when we do things like drinking and smoking and drugs and a range of things, even other things, we get so used to it and gratified by it, and we want that gratification, and it gets to a point where we become addicted. Is addiction a major part of the psychosis? Like, is it a big psychological thing, or is it I know there's a habitual sins or habitual things, but could you just unpack a little bit?
So St. Thomas Aquinas says that we always choose at least a perceived good.
Mm-hmm.
We're always seeking at least a perceived good. And so what I see with addictions, my question is always, what's the perceived good?
Yeah.
A lot of old style approaches to addictions was basically, don't do that. Don't do that. Right. It's just stop it, and one of the things that actually has been rediscovered in from secular approaches is that there is a good that's being sought. I mean, actually, they're actually discovering, they don't know it, but they're discovering the summa on this, and that there was some sort of association with the experience that was to meet a deep need. And I'm going to run through 10 the 10 core needs. You can look at almost all problematic behavior, almost all symptoms as a result of, in terms of these needs. So Brown and Elliott wrote a book in 2016 called Attachment Disturbances in Adults, and they summarized the literature on attachment, on our human relationship, and they came up with 5 primary conditions for secure attachment. That is a felt sense of safety and protection. That's the first one. Second one, feeling seen, heard, known, and understood. Feeling it, not just being seen, heard, known, and understood, but feeling it. Third, feeling comforted, soothed, reassured. Fourth, feeling cherished, treasured, and delighted in. And fifth, feeling that the other person, the attachment figure, the other person has your highest good in mind. I came up with 5 integrity needs that go with these. And these 5 integrity needs are the need to exist and survive, the need to matter, the need to have agency, the need to be good, to be ontologically good, and the need for mission and purpose. And when you look at all kinds of problematic behaviors, you can usually trace it to an attempt to meet one or more of those 10 needs. Or it takes a person back to a time where one of those 10 needs seemed to have been met.
Yeah.
So when you look at somebody, for example, sometimes some symptoms don't make a lot of sense to people if they've never been in that particular kind of dark hole, like cutting. All right, cutting on oneself. All right. We've recognized that if you get down to the bottom of that, it has different meanings because the symptoms can reflect different underlying conditions. But some people cut because when they see the blood come out, they know they're still alive. They feel so dead that they're looking for some kind of confirmation that they still exist, that they're still alive, right? That's an integrity need, the need to know that I exist. So if you understand that as the problem, that's quite different than understanding the cutting as a problem. You see the difference between the symptom and the underlying cause, right? Right. And so if this particular person were to come into contact, receive the love of God, know that she was a beloved daughter of God, you wouldn't need the cutting to prove that you exist.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So what I think about when I think about addiction, and that could be a behavioral compulsion, as a way to continue to prove that I exist, or just that I feel something, right? Because sometimes there's so much dissociation, there's so much numbing out. That's the way the person knows to feel anything. I go back to these 10 primary needs. What's the answer to it all? It sounds simple, right? Going back to the Beatles, right? All you need is love.
Yeah.
But the question is, how does that make sense for that person? How does that get lived out with that person in that moment, in that situation? That's where you need attunement. You need to really be able to enter in to the other person's phenomenological world. And the number one thing that prevents us from doing that is our own formation, our own human formation, our own spiritual formation.
Very interesting. I'm just thinking as you were saying that, and especially the first 5, you're familiar with a book written on the 5 love languages, and what that's trying to identify. And I just can't help thinking, is there some correlation here somehow? Because those needs in the 5 are basically needs, aren't they? The 5 love languages are how what's been identified there, and it's a man of faith. It's what's your comment, I guess, the 5 love languages? Are you familiar with them? And then
I think it's brilliant in the sense that it gets people thinking about these things and gets people thinking that you want to be able to understand love in the mode of the receiver, right?
Yes.
I mean, I've heard people say things like, well, that's just the way I love, I always give my nieces and my nephews a great big wet kiss on the face, regardless of whether they want it or not, because that's how I show my love. Well, that could be like really intrusive and invasive, right? Like, whoa, this is not love, right? No. So I think we really want to remember that we're working with somebody who might see the world very, very differently than we do. Saint Therese of the Zoo, said that our souls are so much different from one another, more so than our faces, and so how we react to something, can vary wildly from person to person, depending on what our particular experience of that particular thing is, So we want to be able to enter into another person's phenomenological world, to be safe enough to be invited in.
Yeah, very good.
Most people are really alienated. They really struggle with feeling seen, heard, known, and understood. They really, this one of feeling treasured, delighted in. You know, I was just talking not long ago with a psychologist friend of mine, Dr. Peter Martin, who said that's the toughest one, to have a sense of like really feeling it in our bones that God cherishes us and delights in us. And sometimes that's because of, you know, the lack of integration. It could be lack of faith, could also be desolation, right? I mean, you know, you know, as we look at the biography, the autobiography of Mother Teresa, right? Long periods of time where she wasn't feeling that, you know, but she was granted the faith to be able to at least understand that, you know, in a knowing by faith way. So, so the way that we can help others, if we really want to love our neighbor, I think we want to make sure that we're bringing in some of these ideas, even like the love languages, right? That was a popular book that came out, you know, it was readily accessible. And I think it helped a lot of people to actually recognize that, hey, my spouse's love language is touch and mine is giving gifts. And this is just very different how, you know, what we're looking for in the relationship. You know, because we, you know, sometimes we take it a little too literally, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, you know, we want to understand that a little more broadly than the particular behavior, because you might have an idiosyncratic thing, you know, and your wife might not want you to just serve her a beer and have her watch the football game or the soccer game, right? I mean, she may have a very different thing. She might have a conversation or something, right? So, you know, so there's a, you know, we want to really appreciate what other people, not just what they want, but what they need. And how do we offer it to them, you know, incrementally? You know, St. Paul talks about, you know, meat and milk. You have to be careful in the approach too about what can they tolerate. Like God was, right, in the garden, calling out to them. If he had appeared in front of them in the bushes, you know, full manifestation of all his glory, they couldn't take that. You know, they couldn't take that. So he lets them know he's coming from a distance. You know, lets them have an opportunity to run further if they choose to, because they could have fled further into the bushes. They chose not to. They sensed something, sensed a possibility.
Yes. Yeah, very
So
good.
what we want to do is be safe enough to be able to connect. And you don't have to be a psychologist to do this. You don't have to be a mental health professional to do this. But there are some really important things in human formation that you could learn and that you could experience and that you could correct in your own self, because St. Thomas Aquinas basically says that we're going to love others like we love ourselves. You know, and so if there are parts of us that we reject, if there are parts of us that we condemn, if there are parts of us that we won't tolerate, that we force into the unconscious, that we try to banish, we're not going to tolerate those very well in anybody else either. And so the reason we need to love ourselves, our Lord tells us this, Luke 10:27, love your neighbor as yourself, is not, you know, it's not just so that, you know, this is not a sort of throwaway line. We actually do need to love ourselves in order to value ourselves, in order to be able to make a gift of ourselves to anybody else. If we treat ourselves badly, if we think of ourselves as worthless, what kind of gift are we going to be able to make of ourselves? So there's a lot of human formation work that we need to do, even more so now, because we've gotten so far away from natural law. We've gotten so far away from what we can observe and what we can embrace using unaided, human reason alone. And so there's actually a greater need for it now than there might have been in years past.
I agree. Yeah, that's fascinating. I wish we had more time because we could go. I think there's courses and a whole range of things that you've actually got. Can we talk about your website? I mean, Hearts and Souls. Let's
sure.
talk about Souls and Hearts.
Souls and Hearts. Yeah. So, you know, Souls and Hearts. So I worked in private practice for almost 20 years. And I was like, you know what? I'm starting to feel a call. I've got to try to get this out to the world more. I'm not just supposed to stay in my consulting office with my, my 20 clients, and my comfortable little hobbit hole that I'm in, which I'm in right now. And this is part of my house. It's a very nice little setup. I've got a little 5-acre farm, and so forth. But I had a sense that God was calling me to like get this out more into the world. And so, so what we're doing with the Souls and Hearts, what we're trying to do, this is the big goal, this is the why that Souls and Hearts exists, is to help people have this deep, personal, intimate relationship with God the Father, with Mary our mother, to be able to receive love and to love back. And a lot of other ministries, a lot of other organizations are focused on this, but our particular corner of the vineyard is to overcome the natural level obstacles, the human formation obstacles, the things that get in the way because of our human formation. And you don't have to just go to therapy or counseling for that. Therapy and counseling don't have a monopoly on that. When Adam and Eve were banished from the garden, we're back in Genesis 3, and there's an angel with a fiery sword. There wasn't like a community mental health clinic that just sort of sprang up, right? We have other ways that we can work with this. So what my partner, Dr. Jerry Creed, and I have done is we're bringing together the best of human formation resources, the best of psychological resources, grounded in a Catholic faith, grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person. These kind of resources that are retrofitted to understand who we are as beloved sons and daughters of God. And so we bring that out in that website. We're the most active, we're the biggest Catholic psychology website out there. We started out doing courses, and what we've come to more and more is the importance of community. We're really focused, this is the way I think about it, we're really focused on the salvation of hearts. There's a lot of talk about the salvation of souls. We're focused on the salvation of hearts. If you save the heart, you will save the soul. And right now, so many people, the way to the soul is through the heart. You've got to start with the heart, or none of the rest of it will make sense. You've got to meet them in some way that they can understand. If you start talking about like a lot of theological stuff, or even a lot of apologetics or catechesis, it's all up in the head. It's all up in the head. We want to go for the heart by heart. We work at an individual level. That doesn't mean we're doing all one-on-one stuff, but we are bringing people together in communities where they have accountability partners, where they're meeting in small groups, and they're able to take in the kind of resources that we offer, like in the Resilient Catholics community, which is a community that I lead. We've got a whole year-long program to help you with your human formation. It's grounded in a particular way of looking at internal change and integration called internal family systems. That's well adjusted. It's well able to be engaged in with somebody wanting to do their own work. So we set up conditions for success where people can be on this pilgrimage together. We call our small groups companies, and we call like our accountability partners companions, sort of like the Lord of the Rings, because we're on this adventure. We're on this adventure towards better human formation. So Souls and Hearts doesn't really have a spirituality per se. I mean, it's all grounded in Catholicism, but because it's human formation, it's not really working in the spiritual realm primarily. And so that's why our patron is Saint John the Baptist, because he prepared the way for the Lord. We're shoring up the natural foundation for the spiritual life. We're helping to overcome, because whatever problems you have in relationships, Charbel, whatever it is, avoidance or fear of vulnerability or whatever it is, you're going to take that into your relationship with God. Anything that you struggle with on relationships here on earth in your natural level connections, you're going to bring that into your relationship with God.
Interesting. I mean, we've heard it many of the saints. Grace builds on nature, doesn't it?
Grace perfects nature. Exactly. Yeah. And so we don't want to neglect that. We don't want to neglect that. Otherwise, there can be all kinds of spiritual form. And this is what I was finding 20 years ago when clients were first coming to see me. They had gone through so many spiritual means. They had tried so many spiritual solutions. And it's not that those things were bad, but we were dealing with a natural level problem. If you've been in a car accident and you've got a bad cut, you've got arterial bleeding, you're going to use a natural level solution, probably a tourniquet, probably getting to the hospital, repairing those arteries, rather than looking for a spiritual solution, right? And so what we want for folks is to be able to have these solutions, these answers on the natural level. Why? So that they can begin to connect with their spiritual parents, their primary parents, God the Father, Mary, our mother. Those are who we're called to be in primary relationship with. Our natural level parents ideally should point the way to God the Father and Mary, our mother. But we don't think about it that way, and this is really ultimately where I think we have to go. Yes. And so that's what our efforts are all focused on. Our why, about the salvation of hearts, really working at that felt level. Not that feelings are everything. I don't want to get caught up into some, so the idea that subjectivism is everything, because it's not. But to be able to work in that natural realm, because there's been so much trauma, so much disruption there.
Fantastic. That the website for people, if they want to get to know more or get involved or learn more about what you do.
Yeah. The website is soulsandhearts.com. I do a podcast called Interior Integration for Catholics. It's on all the major podcast networks or podcast platforms. And then I also do a weekly reflection that I put out every Wednesday. You can sign up for that at soulsandhearts.com on the homepage. And then we have the different communities, right? I have a whole community. I have about 80 Catholic therapists in the interior therapist community from all over the world, including Australia, including New Zealand. So yeah. So they're learning, and what we focus on in that community is all about their human formation, because the number one thing that keeps a Catholic therapist from being able to really help a client is their own human formation. It's not about their professional development. It's not about their skill set. It's not about, their techniques and all of that. Usually it comes because there's some kind of block in the therapist that's preventing the therapist from being able to connect with the client in that same kind of area. There's a blind spot, there's a no-go zone, something there. And so it's a very different way of thinking about of supervision, thinking about consultation. So, so there's these different communities. The Resilient Catholics community. We also have the Catholic Journeymen, which is for men who are working on overcoming they're working towards chastity. They're working towards purity in their relationships. We've got that community. And then just a ton of resources. If you go to our resources page, we have them all alphabeticalized for everything from addictions to vocational discernment. So lots and lots and lots of resources there.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to I noticed that vocational one, discerning what God's call in your life and your purpose in life. So that sounds very interesting. I might do that myself. I feel I've found it, but it's great to learn tips and it's just great. I think if everyone did what God was calling them to do, then we'll be a lot more happier and more joy-filled and at peace and fulfilled, I guess. So yeah, praise God. Thank you for your work. I'm fascinated. I wish we had a lot more time, but love to get you back on down the track and maybe let's keep promoting this and get people more aware that there are Catholic psychologists out there or clinical psychologists, and there's a great network, and let's get and connect across the world here. So I'm super excited to be paired up with you. One of the things I really noticed, like I said, was in your mission statement, you're about the relationship, and I love to partner with organizations that get it, that it's about the relationship. It's not about power spirituality or macho spirituality, overcoming all our vices, gaining all the virtues, but never being in a loving relationship with God. So you guys get that. Super excited that you're on that, and glad to be on the same team with all of you at Perusia. So thank you so much. Well, please pray for our work. We're praying for your work.
Yes, absolutely.
And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Peter.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Charbel.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you've got a lot out of that, as I did. If you want to know more, please go to Hearts. Let me get this right. Soulsandhearts.com. Soulsandhearts.com. Let's get there. We'll put the link in the description below, and let's pray for this great ministry and pray for Dr. Peter and his team and the work that they're doing, because I see a huge need in this area. Thanks again, everyone. I'm Charbel Raish, and thanks again. And until next time, God bless you.